I want you to think of your favorite 1980s horror character right now. How many of you said Ashley J. Williams? Maybe not many, considering there are characters like Michael Myers, Freddy Krueger, Jason Voorhees, and the like, all in that group right there. Everyone always talks about the antagonists, but there's gotta be some credit for the horror protagonists in the mix. And I don't mean the final girl scream queens like Laurie Strode or Sidney Prescott. Although, they're cool. They're no Ash Williams. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Bruce Campbell and Sam Raimi created what nowadays we understand as one of the greatest gore horror franchises, The Evil Dead. We have Evil Dead 1 and 2 in the 1980s, Bruce Campbell versus the Army of Darkness in the 90s, The Evil Dead, the 2013 remake, and even Ash vs. Evil Dead sprinkled in there, with appearances by Ash and other characters in the Evil Dead video game and games like Dead by Daylight. The franchise has already cemented itself among some of the horror greats, Evil Dead 2 being a part of my personal top picks in horror list. But nowadays, we have something that's a little less campy. That is, of course, the release of the newest Evil Dead film, Evil Dead Rise. Now, I know we've still got a little bit of time ahead of us to discuss the details of this film, but I want to make it very clear to you, and I'm not going to mince words, and believe me when I tell you, this movie is up. The blood and gore at this movie is top-notch. I mean, gory enough to the point where I was stomping my feet not wanting that one thing to happen, and we'll get into that in a moment. But believe me when I tell you, if you are a gore freak like I am, you will 100% be satisfied with this movie. So to start off the discussion, I want to make it really clear that I think the Evil Dead films, sort of like the Scream franchise, is one that really just doesn't miss. I mean, I don't know one bad movie in the Evil Dead franchise. And you know what? We can even throw in the musical, because that's entertaining as hell too. Where the Evil Dead films in the 80s and 90s aimed for more of a campy horror feel to characters like Ash Williams and the Deadites, the 2013 remake and Evil Dead Rise, as we see here, really ditches that camp. The comedy is not lost, believe me, but the sort of slapstick humor that you find in Evil Dead 2 really just isn't present. And while this film in particular is not set in a cabin in the woods like Evil Dead 1, 2, and the remake, the foundation is still there. I mean, thematically, everything still holds. Instead of a cabin in the woods, they're in a decrepit apartment building. Instead of the bridge breaking down so they can't get out of the woods, the elevator and the stairwell break down so they can't get out of the apartment. The Necronomicon is found in a creepy basement. The voice is read off of a recording. The Deadites are 50% of the entertainment factor in this film. And spoiler alert, the humans win. Kinda. And if that's not enough for you, there are numerous references to Evil Dead lore that make sure you, the viewer, know that the filmmakers behind Evil Dead Rise did their homework. Some of my favorites include Deadite Ellie yelling, "I'll swallow your soul!" Or the collection of Deadites in the hallway screaming, "Dead by dawn! Dead by dawn!" Which led me and my friend, who I was seeing the movie with, to chant "Dead by dawn" in the movie theater along with the Deadites. And most importantly, when the main character Beth gets the chainsaw towards the end of the movie, she lets out the infamous line, "Come get some." Although nobody lost a hand. Seems like it's a staple in the Evil Dead franchise now. Maybe they're moving away from it. Maybe it's for good reason. In terms of plot, this film sort of moves away from the general idea that the people in this secluded area are a group of friends, and rather, this time around, it's a family. It's Beth, her sister Ellie, and then Ellie's children, Bridget, Danny, and Cassie. Along with a few other people that live in the apartment complex, kind of used as cannon fodder to make the Deadites feel like a legitimate threat. All in all, it's really just those four that the plot centers around. Oh yeah, there's also 3 characters at the beginning, but we'll get to that in a second. Evil Dead Rise only has a runtime of 96 minutes, but at the beginning, it doesn't start in the apartment complex quite yet. It starts at a cabin in the woods. There are 3 characters whose names I do not remember, and one of them turns into a Deadite, scalps one girl, and I think decapitates the guy, and then she jumps in a lake or something like that. Title card, Evil Dead Rise, hard cut to the introduction of Beth and her going to the apartment complex, and we've got a movie. If you're anything like me and you've been hearing about this movie for the past couple of weeks, you've heard that it's an incredibly disgusting, gory horror flick, and that's true. The one detriment I would say to hearing that is that you're constantly waiting for it to ramp up, especially with the intro of the film where someone gets their scalp ripped off of their head forcefully. You're always waiting for that next piece of gore. And while the film does need to give exposition to the main characters, Ellie and her family, it does feel like it gets a little slow at some points when you're just waiting for that next person to die. I mean that in a nice way. You know, we're all horror freaks, we all have the same idea. By using the family aspect and making that the center of your film, it makes the stakes of this movie feel so much higher. Especially someone like you and I, who have seen Evil Dead movies countless number of times. We know what Deadites and the evil are capable of. To see that happen to some high school friends who probably met each other smoking underneath the bleachers, you know, they're expendable characters. As much as I love the first Evil Dead, basically everyone in there, with the exception of Ash, is a cannon fodder character, really. When you get to Evil Dead Rise, everybody feels important, which makes the Deadites coming out for blood that much more terrifying. Because seeing the family, seeing how much they love each other and how much they've built their world around each other, it's just that much more devastating to see one of them bite the dust. As a viewer, you form a really deep connection with each of the family members. And that, honestly, is just a testament of a really good script. While Danny is the one that opens the Necronomicon, which isn't called the Necronomicon for some reason, and releases the evil, his mother Ellie is the one that catches the brunt of it. She's the one that becomes the Deadite and the vessel for the evil to enter the apartment building. She obviously goes on a murderous rampage, killing all of the other tenants in the hallway after Beth locks the door of their apartment, sort of sentencing everybody else to their death. Once Ellie gets back into the apartment, she infects her daughter, Bridget, with a tattoo needle. Bridget becomes a Deadite. Bridget kills Danny, her brother, and he becomes a Deadite, leaving only Beth and the very young Cassie to fend for themselves in a building now full of, give or take, 6 or 7 Deadites. Not the best odds. Towards the end of the film, Bridget, Danny, and Ellie all form into this one Deadite conglomerate monster that I'm not really sure how it fits, and I don't know how I'd place it amongst Evil Dead villains. Obviously, we do have the occasional fantasy-inspired villain like Henrietta with the long neck that grows, you know what I'm talking about. In this movie, it felt sort of out of place to begin with, but as it progressed and as the monster became more and more known to the viewer, it felt like it fit eventually. So, of course, Beth survives by attacking this conglomerate Deadite monster with a chainsaw and a wood chipper, which makes for a lot of fake blood, let me tell you. And I know that there have been some talks flying around of a sequel possibly being made. Now, it's revealed in the movie that Beth is carrying a child while she's going through all of this, so if the child does survive the trauma that Beth's body has been put through, I find it hard to believe that she will then become the next Ash Williams, you know, the leader of the Evil Dead franchise going forward. But if the script lends itself to that, and it works out that way, that Beth is the face of Evil Dead, I'm all for it. Her personality and her character and the acting all made for a very convincing performance as the lead of this film. The way Beth interacts with her sister and her nieces and nephews and her surroundings really makes you as the viewer connect with her on a deeper level, as she's the kind of person that's sort of just falling through life, not really knowing where she's going to end up next, constantly facing life problems, and generally being put down by everybody, and being pushed to the dredges of society as a groupie, as Ellie calls her. She's the kind of unwilling hero or unwilling protagonist that is really easy to root for. The Deadites, on the other hand, are really easy to wish them dead again. They are absolutely brutal. As I said earlier, this film really leans more towards horror than comedy, and this is made very well known in scenes when Ellie is brought into the bathtub. The kids ask, "Where's my mom?" and she goes, "Mommy's with the maggots now." It's just simple lines like that, simple ways that these actors are acting out themselves as Deadites in their demeanor that just make these evil versions of themselves that much more believable. And something that I did also really like about it, even though this points a little bit more towards the horror genre in general, is that this movie was not afraid to show the blood and guts. So many horror movies nowadays will imply violence when their entire marketing scheme has been touting how violent the movie is. Evil Dead Rise said it was going to be bloody, said it was going to be violent, and it delivered 110%. These Deadites were not afraid to do anything, they had no boundaries, and it shows when you watch this film. Yep, that's me, forgetting to add some pretty important points about what I thought were the best uses of gore. Notable elements include Bridget swallowing glass, the Deadite monster getting thrown into a wood chipper, the girl getting scalped at the lake, and the worst of the bunch, Beth getting a cheese grater to the leg. Anyway, back to the programming. Maybe don't watch it right after eating. I think some of it might come up. I have two pretty hefty problems with this movie. Not enough to really detract from my enjoyment of it, just as a whole. The first one is that I don't know if they couldn't change faces, or if they just didn't, but the Deadites didn't change faces. In other Evil Dead films, as the Deadites are trying to get the characters to sympathize with them, and maybe pull one over on our main characters, they change their faces to look like their previously alive counterparts. In Evil Dead Rise, this would have been a perfect opportunity when Ellie is standing outside the door and her daughter Cassie is looking through the peephole. If Deadite Ellie is trying to convince Cassie to open the door, wouldn't it be just perfect if the Deadite reverted back to the face of living Ellie? It seems like a perfect opportunity that was missed for whatever reason. I don't know, I'm not part of the writing team, I can't tell you. With the exception of somebody not losing a hand or not saying groovy, this was really the one aspect of Evil Dead that just was not present in this film. My last problem isn't necessarily a problem with this movie, it's an issue that I have with the Evil Dead franchise as a whole. It's understood that you either have to read from the Necronomicon or speak the words in the Necronomicon to raise the evil and bring it to Earth. And yet, when we watch the movies, it's always the characters listening to a recording of that reciting of the words. It's always the characters listening to a recording of somebody reading those words, which would imply that they've already let the evil out, so why does the evil have to be let out again? Where has the evil been? Taking a vacation in the Bahamas? Especially in Evil Dead Rise, the priest on the record explains that he released the evil. Where has it been? Why has it not been ravaging the world in the last 100 years since he let it out? Why does Danny have to be the one responsible to let the evil out again? And it's also made very clear that this evil is unstoppable, where in the previous Evil Dead films, total dismemberment would render the evil incapable. In this one, the conglomerate monster is thrown through a wood chipper, and yet the evil still comes back to haunt the girl going to the cabin that we see at the beginning of the movie. I'm not sure if this is a script disconnect, a franchise disconnect, or something that we just have to suspend disbelief of. That being said, if it's Evil Dead we're talking about, I am willing to suspend that disbelief all the time. The Evil Dead franchise is one that I genuinely adore. I try and get all of my friends to watch it, especially the early ones, and I always tell them it's a little bit more comedy than horror, when you and I know that that's not always the case. Evil Dead Rise was so enjoyable. I loved every second of it. Not quite sure where it places in my ranking of the franchise, considering the fact that I've never created a ranking of the franchise, but my one hope for this is that we actually start getting some legitimate sequels, instead having to wait another 10 years like we did since the last one. Let me know what you think of the Evil Dead franchise, Evil Dead Rise, Ash Williams, any of the characters. Really, let's just have a conversation about Evil Dead, because I can keep it going for ages. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, thanks for being groovy, and hail to the king, baby.